Thank you, everyone. Thank you. I am very delighted to be able to present here in the last session of the first day of the 2017 Crunch conference. My name is Mikko, and yes, like Madeline said, I was recently CEO for Infogram until the company's acquisition earlier this year by Prezi. And the title of the talk is Why Data Visualization Works, and sometimes called Data Viz if I run out of syllables, annotated with how data visualization works. And there's not going to be a whole lot of engineering in this. There's not going to be a whole lot of tech stack, actually none, like zero. But there's going to be a broader framework, a theoretical framework for understanding the work that we do in data visualization. But before I even properly introduce myself, allow me to do this. Allow me to calibrate my talk a little bit, so I'll find out a little more about you. So, first of all, by show of hands, how many here is able to raise their hand? Okay, good. So that's instrument calibration. Now I have a baseline. Now I kind of understand what this instrument is capable of. Good. How many here, at least once a month, have to visualize data from scratch? Meaning create a new report, for instance, that you can't just copy from last month's report, everything, but create a visualization from scratch. Every once a month, more or less, every once in a while. Good. Awesome. Thank you. And now I'm going to ask you 4 quiz questions, and there are no right or wrong answers. If you really don't know what I'm talking about, just that's fine. But how many here recognize this example and could tell me what it's about? Okay. Yeah, a fair few people. Great. Awesome. Okay. In that case, how many people know what this concept is about? There's a story behind this, and excellent. Great. This is awesome to see. Good. Level 3, how many of you know what these 4 charts are and what they are used to argue for? Awesome, good, good. Some of the same hands as well. All right. And then, in the context of the theory of Shannon information, what does this equation represent? Really? Good. Awesome. Oh, awesome. Great. I'm so happy to be here. This is good. Okay, cool. So that was a little calibration. The content's not going to change, but how I present some of the things will actually change there. So first, we'll go over a brief history of data visualization, 5 carefully selected examples, and I think it's awesome to look at history because if there are patterns that have existed, that persist hundreds, maybe even 1,000 years to today, there's probably something fundamental to how we communicate or how we visualize things. After that, we'll talk about the core ideas and dynamics of data visualization, why it works. And this is going to be theory heavy, but I'll pepper you with practical examples every here and there. And finally, we'll wrap this up by putting this in 5 or so practical steps, I believe. But first, and kind of unconventionally, I want to do very quick sources and inspiration. I mentioned 2 names. Michael Friendly, a psychologist, University of York in Canada, who has done more than anyone in recording, analyzing, and ordering the history of data visualization. And George Lakoff, a cognitive scientist and a philosopher of language, whose work on metaphors and our understanding of metaphors is actually fundamental to understanding data visualizations and why they work as well as they do. And with that, I'll introduce myself a little bit more, not only because I like talking about myself, but because so you'll get a bit more context. So also explains why I usually just go by my first name, because my name is Mikko Jarvenpaa. I'm originally from Finland, currently off San Francisco. And I started my career in technology in the tech hotbed of Costa Rica of the late 90s, coding HTML pages in order to finance my surfing trips to the coast. I was with Google for about 5 years, product marketing manager mostly, until quitting that job in order to become a tour manager for a death metal band, which I thought was a sensible choice, but My parents didn't agree. But I did go back to school, have a graduate degree in philosophy of social sciences, and after that went back to technology and have worked with startups on kind of both sides of the investment table, with HackForward, a European startup investor through which I then met Infogram. And now we get to this point of the story. And I was a CEO for Infogram for about 3 years. Infogram, if you don't know, has a data visualization toolkit, a very easy-to-use data visualization app for creating interactive, engaging charts, maps, graphs, and so forth. Especially kind of the basic, the 80% of your basic data visualization needs. If you hand code your visualizations, this might not be something that you use. However, I wholeheartedly recommend that you should do so. And yeah, like Madeline said, Infogram was recently acquired by Prezi, happily acquired by Prezi earlier this year. And I see now that I've kind of ended my lifeline at the Crunch conference here, which is not a good sign, so I'm not superstitious, but just please somebody make sure I make it to the train and so forth. With that, let's look at some charts. Okay. So, history of data viz in 5 images. In reverse chronological order, we're going to look at something that has an everyday application to our lives. We're going to look at a very ambitious visualization from the late 19th century. We'll look at a cartogram from France, and we'll look at a visualization of history that is an attempt at showing relations of multiple individual, unconnected things. But we'll start with this. This is essentially a line chart that's over 1,000 years old. I think we don't know who the creators of this are exactly. It's either from Italy or France, but what this shows is the movement of heavenly bodies, so that is planets, stars, the moon, over time. And this is interesting because it's actually not a data visualization, and it's kind of a pseudo-abstraction because it has, on the horizontal axis, it shows time, right? But then on the vertical axis, it actually shows observation. So you could imagine that it's been done by actually like looking at the sky, and if something's low in the sky, it goes low in the chart, and if something's high, it goes high. So not necessarily through data, but through observation. But what this does show us is that we have for a long time had this challenge of plotting change against other change and over time. And this is a beautiful example of something that we have been doing for over 1,000 years, it seems. A little more recent, from the 18th century, this is a beautiful example of attempting to get an overall idea of an extremely complex and multi-layered whole, so history. This is a specimen from Joseph Priestley's 1 meter long and pretty tall canvas where he plots 1,000 names over 3,000 years and shows their lifespan in those lines, and you're able to see like how they relate to each other. Because this kind of information would be impossible to keep in mind, would it be impossible to have like a complete mental image of, for most people at least, even if you've read everything there is to read about history. And so this is really cool because you'll be able to tell like just from this specimen, which is a part of that, the bigger whole, that yeah, indeed, like Aristoteles and Demosthenes were philosophers at the time of Alexander the Great. Yes, absolutely. And you'll be able to see like how those maybe relate to each other, like where the overlaps are. The third example is a cartogram. Maps are some of the earliest data visualizations we have, mostly used for navigation early on, of course. But with the explosion of data from social sciences, which was really the result of the Enlightenment idea that we can be masters of our own fates if we just understand the world better, collect data about it, record it, so forth. By this time, by the early 19th century, there was already a wealth of social science data, statistics, and tools like maps were used as context, to give context to this kind of data. And this is an example of literacy rates in France. The next one is, Michael Friendly calls the second half of 19th century the golden age of data graphics. And looking at something like this, 100 years before computer graphics would make this possible, can give you an idea why. So this is a population pyramid of Sweden plotted over 125 years, created by the Italian Luigi Perozzo. A very ambitious way of telling a complex data story, but definitely one that resonates with us. Like, we can read that, we can understand why it's being created, we can, even much easier these days, create similar ones. And the last one is everyday applications. So we're back to maps. In this case, the London Tube map. This is a map that deprioritizes geographical accuracy and prioritizes the readability and utility to the users. So in that sense, it is an abstraction, much more than maps usually are. But it is indeed something that has been used by millions and millions of people. So by this time, the population starts to get pretty comfortable with these kinds of visualizations. This is also my personal favorite, because this was the time that I realized for the first time how cool this kind of abstraction of data into visualizations is. And actually, when I was 16, I traveled around Europe for the first time solo, and my goal was London, just get to London. And this was the first map I got. Like, I had the London map in the small town in Finland where I grew up, the London Tube map, before any other maps, and yeah, that's where I headed. Okay, so a brief history of data viz. So why do these work as well as they do? Like, why are we able to understand them? I've got 4 key concepts about data visualization that I'm going to go through. The first one is intuition. Some of the data viz that we see can be intuitively understood, and they're very powerful because of that. Cognition plays, of course, a large part. Cognition is the kind of an umbrella of our mental processes, from perception all the way to memory and recall, and we'll look at that in detail. Literacy is a key factor once you realize that data visualization is a kind of language. It has similar components as a language does. It can be learned in a similar way as language. And the fourth one is process. That's different, because that is data visualization as an action. That is something that we do, many of us do in our daily lives. Okay? Cool. So, intuition first. The modern cognitive science, psychology, has taught us that we are not as rational as we'd like to believe, often, and that we are more on autopilot than we would ever like to believe. Most of the things we do as unconscious reactions, and our verbal narrative, our conscious mind, is able to create the rationale for that after the fact. And we even believe that rationale then. And we're simple beasts in a way, but we're multi-layered with lots of feedback loops, so that's what makes it complex. But so, intuition about data viz. Why does it work? Let's look at an example. Let's just kind of feel our way through this. History of the Olympics. So, during the history of the existence of the Soviet Union, so from approximately 17 to 90, the 2 world superpowers, USA and the USSR, were competing on all possible fronts, competing in the space race, competing in the nuclear arms race, and competing in sports. And now, if we wanted to figure out which one of these superpowers won the sports part of this contest, we could measure that by tallying up the total medals that they won in the Olympic Games and take a look at that. So let's do that. So, what do you think? Did you feel you have an answer? What did you just see? So we went from a state of not necessarily knowing, I mean, some sports fans here probably did, but not knowing which one of these powers it was, to a state where you maybe feel like you have an answer, and that thing was actually on the screen longer than I wanted it to be. So what did you see? Yeah, kind of. You saw this. You saw two rectangles and a line, right? I mean, that's not a chart, really. That is, it doesn't have, numbers or lines or labels. It doesn't even tell what it's showing. But yet, you were able to have an idea. Now, this is a data visualization. This is a chart. So, and I made it faithful, of course, to the original chart. So why were you able to get an idea? And I would argue that most of you did. Take this up with me after the talk if you didn't, if you disagree. Why were you able to get this idea? So first of all, context. This is easy. Like, you're in a talk about data visualization, so you would hope that this guy shows you some data visualization. So you were expecting that. Then, if you belong to the about 95% of the population that doesn't have color blindness of some sort, you probably recognized the colors. And those were not in conflict with your cultural understanding of the Cold War colors, where red is for the commies and blue is for the capitalist imperialists. And you also saw them on the same sides of the screen, and you're used to seeing things like column charts. This is a very data literate audience. Like, I didn't ask you if you know what a column chart is in the quiz. I just assumed that. So that's a brief example of the power of intuition. And here's an example of a less intuitive example. And a lot of people said that they recognize this, so I'll just go through this quickly. This is the visual story of Napoleon's rather misfortunate military trek to attack Moscow and to kind of come back, for the most part, really not come back. And it's been dubbed by Edward Tufte, for example, as the most beautiful data visualization in the world, but it was not meant by its creator, Minard, to be intuitively understood. In fact, you could probably spend like 15 minutes with this and look at all the inflection points and how the temperature drops there and like where you lose the troops and so forth. And you can make this choice of offering a data visualization that will clearly not be intuitively understood. Or sometimes you have to make the choice that it has to be intuitively understood. Like, sometimes you're addressing such cognitively challenged and time-poor people that you have to go all the way down to the executive summary, because that's what it is. I mean, executives are people who, just want the conclusion, screw the backstory, just give me the results, preferably, direct information to brain transfer. Like, okay, this drops the whole richness of the story, of course. But in some cases, this is what you need to show if you want to be able to show something intuitively. And in delivering something like an executive summary, text is usually at a disadvantage to images, because images can get priority processing in the brain, and we'll mention that with cognition more, whereas text doesn't. There's no way that text gets priority processing. Like, text always goes through the rational, the conscious mind, and that's the only way that you get the information, through there. And this was a kind of a wonderful moment, because I saw some people just like look at that chart, look at that screen, and then just pull out their device, which was like a clear reaction to like a lot of text on a slide. Okay. A few words about cognition now. So, like I said, cognition is kind of the umbrella term for understanding our mental processes, from awareness to perception, to acquiring, to analyzing, processing, association, memory, and recall of other things. And how do you get stuff into that system? Perception is the key. So priming controls perception, right? In the USA versus USSR example, you saw some priming, but you can also do other kinds of experiments about this that show you how wedded together perception and intuition really are. Like, if you've ever done this, like you've looked at a group of people or like a cityscape and say the name or say word for a color out loud, like red, and then do the scan. And the red things will just pop out at you. And I was actually snapping at the red things because that's what you're able to do. Like your eyes seem to catch things so fast that you're not even aware of those. And that's actually exactly what happens. Like you can really prime your perception, and you can prime anyone's perception very easily. Data visualizations, charts, graphs, maps are metaphors. They're visual metaphors. And to understand metaphors, we'll talk about this guy. It's not a metaphor. It's a picture of a fruit fly. And we're talking about a fruit fly because the fruit fly shares 60% of its DNA with humans. And it's timely because a couple of weeks ago, the Nobel Prize for Medicine was awarded to Messieurs, I believe, Hall, Rosbach, and Young, who studied this guy, and especially studied the circadian rhythm in our brains. The circadian rhythm dictates circadian mechanism, our internal clock, measures and figures out where we are throughout our day. And that's also the thing that goes haywire if you live in a modern society like ours and you cross continents to go to the other side of the world. We have these millions of years of evolutionary history that we share with the fruit fly. And that has taught us, like, of course, not this organism, not these organisms, but the lineages that inform these organisms, have taught us a lot about metaphors. So why do we associate cold and blue color together? Why is blue a cold color? Is it potentially maybe because for millions of years, when the night falls, color turns blue and it gets cold? Like, that's a very strong association. That's a very strong metaphor that you can't really fight with. And the metaphors that we understand and that inform our language and inform our understanding of things like data visualizations, bear with me, I'll get there, is also embodied, because we have these bodies that we understand the world through. Like, we have a front and a back. Otherwise, we couldn't have concepts like forwards and backwards. And we use those to talk about abstract things, because otherwise we couldn't talk about abstract things. So I say, go forwards in time, and you understand what I mean, although there's no reality in which that's possible. I say, history is behind me. We can say that, we can look at a shelf, and we can say that this price is higher than this price, although they're exactly on the same level. But we can say that because we've understood that the metaphor for something being more is high. So this is a little bit of a deep dive through evolutionary history into talking about what makes us understand metaphors and why metaphors are so crucial. And I'm still gonna add like a really exotic example here. You will never have to visualize data for anybody using the Drydahl language. I guarantee you. Drydahl is a nearly dead language in Australia, but it's fascinating because of its noun genders. It has 4 noun genders. Noun genders are like, in German you have der, die, das, in Spanish el, la, masculine, feminine. Druidal language has 4. The first one is males and most animate objects. The second one is fire, women, and dangerous things. Yes. The third one is everything edible. And the fourth one is everything else, which is fine, because you only have to reflect a very primitive society. So you don't need a noun gender for an iPad, for example. So, that kind of other things, it doesn't actually have to be very big. Now, that's an extreme example, but I want to show you an extreme example because I want to tell you about 2 examples much closer to home. This is pretty recent research that I'm going to talk about. I'm not going to show this. But when bilingual speakers of different languages are tested about their understanding of time or motion, for instance, they understand these things differently. So I love this first example especially. Bilingual speakers of Swedish and Spanish were tested with this kind of a visual line graph in a way, where lines move and you have to figure out like how long something takes or how much time you have left or so forth. And if the same person was asked to describe this in Spanish, they would estimate that they have more time left than if they did in Swedish. And now, the key to understanding this is that the metaphor for time in Swedish is length. You have kort tid for short time, you have lång tid for long time. The metaphor for understanding time in Spanish is quantity. You have mucho tiempo for a lot of time, you have poco tiempo for a small amount of time. And I'm like, you know, struggling not to go into stereotypes of cultural understandings of punctuality, but I think that's a lovely example. More research is needed, however. Even more fascinating, and I really wish that we can take this into a data visualization specific research, German-English bilingual speakers understand movement differently. Shown videos of a man walking. When asked to describe this in a German context, the respondent would more often talk about the completion of this movement. They would refer to something where the person that they're observing is going to, and not just that they're walking, but that they're walking to the car, for instance. And you can say these things, you can say sentences in both languages equally. Like you can say in English, you can say, a man walks to the car. Der Mann geht zum Auto, I believe. But depending on what context you are asked this in, if you're a bilingual speaker, you think of it differently. And so now imagine like just these like highly controlled situations with a single variable. Like, what does that mean for our work in, you know, telling stories with images that can be so multi-interpreted? Like I said, more research is needed, but I definitely hope we get there. But you know, sometimes if you show a line chart and you've got something in the middle and everything's going well, and then you have completely different interpretations of that, you know, maybe there's something like this going on. But language is just one of these things. So literacy is important to understanding the message that you're shown. Like, okay, data visualization, part of the message, a type of message. Language barrier is important because that is the boundary of intuition. You have to be literate, you have to be not only literate, but you have to be fluent in a kind of language to be able to give a message the priority processing of going around the rational mind and direct into the intuition. And we saw a little bit of this in the earlier example. And we can learn to be fluent in really weird things. Like, this is a very data literate audience. And many here are probably not only literate, but completely fluent in this abstract idea of 1 unit out of 100 units being a measure of completion, which is, of course, percentages. And you're fluent in that to the point where you don't need like a data visualization to show something. Like if you've ever seen a pie chart that shows like, say, 60%, and you've been like, duh, like that adds nothing to my information, you've been conscious of this. Like if you're teaching somebody percentages, you know, then it may make sense to, you know, cut a pizza in half and say it was 100%, 50%, so forth. But we can learn these things, and we learn these and we use them, and we can get fluent in them. The thing with knowing the level of literacy of your audience is crucial in order to make sure that your message is understood. And I'll use this example. I'll go into this a little bit, although surprisingly many people figured out it from the word cloud already that there was. But this is an example that cartographers and epidemiologists love because it's a story of a map saving lives. So we're looking at London, 1853, 1854. There's a cholera epidemic raging through London. And this is before the understanding that germs cause disease. This was during the miasma theory of disease for the most part, which is like that bad smells and odors and vapors and so forth cause disease. So a physician by the name of John Snow, no relation to the King of the North, does this exercise where he plots the occurrence of cholera on this map, and he realizes that it centralizes around the Broad Street water pump. So he takes his findings, he takes his argument, he goes to the city decision makers and presents his case like, look, let's do this. Let's just disable this water pump and see what happens. So they do. They remove the handle of the water pump, which is enough, and voila, the cholera cases start to fall and finally eradicate. And later it was found that the causal connection was found. There was a cesspit leaking basically shit into the drinking water. So this is a really nice kind of hero story of, you know, how this one valiant argument, this innovation, breaks through this you know, barrier of change. But this is actually in a bigger context, because this kind of stuff was happening already earlier. Like, this is a map from Leeds over 20 years earlier, which is also plotting cholera cases on the map, just with less granularity. So it should be understood that, or at least assumed, that the people that John Snow showed his argument to were already comfortable with the idea of being communicated in such a fashion, were already knowledgeable enough, even if not literate, at least knowledgeable enough that this could be a way for talking about something like this. Because if you're showing a very, if you have a very controversial claim, and you decide to show it in a brand new language, then you're facing an uphill battle. You're not stacking the odds in your favor in that case. And the reason for making sure that the audience understands your message is that in that way, you get to the intuition, you get to their literacy, and you get to harness the most powerful part of the human mind, which is the ego. Because I love my ideas. Maybe you've noticed. You also love your ideas. We all love our own ideas. And this is the way that data visualization can really work much stronger, in a much more powerful and immediate fashion, is that it allows people to have their own ideas. So in the US, especially, like, Valentine's Day is global, but in the US it's like a big deal. And like every year, especially if you're a male, usually you get this question of like, okay, what should I do for Valentine's Day? So what should I get my boyfriend or girlfriend or wife or, you know, husband or spouse or so forth? And there are answers available, of course, right? For example, here. Now, I could have told you that the best bet is just a romantic date, a hot date. But if I show you this, if I show you that it's better, there's, you know, maybe I should have a source here because this is a highly critical audience. But if I show you that this is what it is, and you should trust this, you know, it's better to have that hot date than the flowers or the gift certificate or the chocolate or so forth, you're likelier to accept that idea than if I just told you that, if you see it. So that's another example of using data visualization as an anchor of an idea. If you get it in people's minds so that they interpret it themselves, you have won in getting that message through, because people usually really love their own ideas. All right, the fourth part of this core ideas, like I said, is slightly different, because this talks about data visualization as an action, as an activity. So I like to think of data visualization in relation to this pyramid of value that we have. At the lowest rung, you have data. And if you process that data, you analyze that data, you visualize that, you change it into information. Because that's what data visualization really is. The output of that, it's not just data, it's information. It tells some kind of a story, right? And then if that information is communicated, received, understood, accepted, it becomes knowledge. And then if that knowledge is applied in practice, in decision-making, for example, it becomes wisdom. So that's what's at stake here. That's kind of like a big picture of data visualization, like what you're doing. So what is the story then, like, of moving from data to information? So the Anscombe Quartet was recognized by some people, but I'll just introduce this briefly, was an example by statistician Francis Anscombe in 1973, where he wanted to show that in order to understand a data set, you really have to graph it. It's not enough to just do descriptive statistics. And in this case, the descriptive part is shown by the coefficient line over here, which in all the cases is the same. And it fits equally well with an R² of 0.67, I think. And his point was like, look, you can't just, tell that this is what the story is if you're doing descriptive statistics, because the stories obviously are very different. So if we look at just one of them, this is the outlier chart of those four. And here you see a story of a pretty clean linear regression and an outlier that's strong enough to kind of throw off that coefficient from that linear regression. And now, in statistics, outliers are often thought of as something that you have to remove because they don't fit your beautiful model. But if you trust the data, then there's two stories here. One of them is, for the most part, everything follows this kind of linear curve. But the second story is, but then there's this outlier, right? Like, how does that happen? If you trust the data, it's like, this is really interesting. This is different from that. And that's what information really is. That's the division between data and information. Information is difference. That's what we do when we look at data and get the story out of there. We're really just interested in difference, in change. Like, when your boss meets you in the morning, like, what does she ask you? She asks you what's new. She doesn't ask you what's unchanged. What's the same as it was yesterday? What's the static? She doesn't ask you that. She asks you, what's the signal, not what's the noise. And if you thought we're going kind of deep with the evolutionary metaphor stuff, you may want to hold your breath, because I'm going to wrap this all up into the heat death of the universe. Kind of. So this, I think, is a really interesting thing with data visualization, is that by doing it well, by intelligently visualizing data, we're adding to the information of a system, right? And a system that is poor in information is high in entropy, according to information theory. I'm talking about Shannon information, which the equation I showed there, which you probably recognized. And so I just want to kind of add this challenge here, that like, if ever you feel, small or meaningless plotting that line, or charting that data, or sending out that sales report, remember that you're our first line of defense against entropy. You're the superheroes fighting informational entropy. You can add information to the system and increase it. All right. So that was kind of the four core ideas. Now, 5 examples, rather briefly, of putting them into action. The first one we already spoke about. We spoke about all of these, but priming. So you want to prime the viewer in order to get the message through into the intuition, into priority processing. And you do it by thinking of data visualization as language, right? You want to be coherent. You want to use the same words. You want to not overwhelm with weird vocabulary. And like coherence, for instance, like if you're telling a story of a prince and a dragon, you don't want to change the words into noble-born lad and a fire-breathing lizard halfway through. I mean, people will understand it rationally, but they lose the intuitive understanding. They lose the plot in a way. So that's what you do with data visualization as well. I'm not going to tell you, what kind of chart to pick for what kind of purpose or what kind of colors to use or that kind of stuff. But what I'm asking you to do is to pick your language and stick to that. And you calibrate the language. This is something we spoke about as well. Like, sometimes you want to tell a large data story that takes people a lot of time. And sometimes you just need to go really simple. It's a big compromise in the richness of the whole story. But also, you don't want to tell everything at the same time, necessarily. You can start small, and you can add to that information. That's a type of priming as well. And have mercy on the poor executives. Mark Twain said this best, like he said many things, that he didn't have time to write a short letter, so he wrote a long one instead. And in the data visualization, data analysis, and processing work we do, that investment that we put into that work, which can be a longer time, which can be more effort, produces a return in the consuming end of that data, the consuming end of that information. So it's actually a pretty good investment. And you want to work the intuition. So data visualizations, like I've said, are visual metaphors. And metaphors get that priority processing in the brain. And this is not an example of a data visualization, but it's a metaphor. And designers of advertising and writers of propaganda have known the power of metaphor for a long time. And this is an example from the 1980s ad campaign for a drug-free America. There was a TV ad where there's a guy with an egg and a guy with a hot frying pan, and he goes, "This is your brain. This is drugs." And then he breaks the egg and it sizzles on the hot pan, and he goes, "This is your brain on drugs. Any questions?" Which is a super powerful metaphor, because it's like, it is so bodily, it's so embodied, it's so visceral, like we can see, almost feel, the drugs fry our brain. And it's powerful. The thing is just, it's a lie. Like, not all drugs are alike. Not all drugs fry our brain, say, as easily as, the jolly alcohol that we mildly poison ourselves with so gladly. And because, this is just a propaganda piece for the war on drugs that did much more harm to the whole problem than good. And that's the thing with metaphor. It is powerful, and with great power comes great responsibility. And that's the dark side of it. And we see that happen so much these days, both in data visualization and in other types of communications where metaphor is used. Because we live in an age where politicians are not punished for repetitive lying, in an age where the trust in news is at its all-time low, and when leaders of great countries blame the experts for the problems of their voters, like in the UK, and you've seen what happened there. So this is what I challenge you with, is to wield that power of communicating with your visuals and with your metaphors responsibly. And the last point that I'm just going to leave you with is pick your metaphor and trust your gut to do it, because that's the best way. Because after all, we are talking about data visualization. You don't have to go into deep aesthetic theory or evolutionary metaphor stuff like I did. But pick your metaphor that best illustrates your story and stick with that. Your gut will know best, because your gut relies on those millions of years of evolution. And there is that power of metaphor that you can harness in your work, and that you can really keep at the back of your mind, maybe not at the everyday level of the stuff you do, but every once in a while taking a step back and thinking, like, what's the story that this tells? What are the choices that I've made for figuring out what are the parts of the language and what's my metaphor like? And use that to your advantage in telling your stories with data and without. Thank you.
Mikko, thank you so much for that. So we have some questions. Interesting that got the most votes.
That's awesome.
So the question is, which death metal band did you manage?
It's a relevant question because this was the first time I ever came to Budapest. It was on this nearly through rusted bus with 9 smelly, hairy people, and the band was called Battle Lore. It's not exactly death metal, it's like epic fantasy death metal, you know? You know? Good.
Okay, so what difference do you see in how static and interactive data visualization works or should work?
Yeah, so the one really cool thing that actually got me thinking about the whole kind of visual, interacting with the visual metaphor, kind of the kinetic part of that and the embodied part of that was the interactivity of visualizations that we do with Infogram. So there is, if you have interactivity, you're able to show less at any given time. You're able to give your viewer more freedom in figuring out what is it that they want to see. And like you saw in some of those examples, if they're in control of what they see, they will also like it much better because they are more likely to think that it's kind of their idea.
Okay, all right. So, next question. Do you think sounds will join and expand visualization for better prompt perception?
Yes. Yes.
In a word? Okay. So, next one. So, what data visualization tools do you use or recommend?
I'd have to calibrate that answer a little bit to figure out if you're asking, if you're very technical, if that's a technical question or not. Of course, I'll recommend Infogram, right? I mean, the charting capabilities are beautiful. It has an API if you're technical, of course, also, and the maps are awesome. So.
Right. Okay. So, in a global economy, how is it possible to make cross-country visualizations?
Yeah, okay, that's really cool. A lot of the kind of cultural understanding of communications that we have these days is not, there are those language differences that we spoke about, but it's even more like in this room we have people from a lot of different countries, but we all have the similar understanding, similar fluency in data visualizations, for instance. So I'm not hugely worried about that if you know that you're talking to a kind of a uniform audience, even if they're from different countries, if that makes sense.
Okay. So our final question is, what tools would you recommend for learning data viz?
For learning data viz? For learning data viz, I think I would recommend a couple of books, maybe. I think I would actually start from something from data journalism, because there you have to be addressing a very wide audience. The downside with data journalism often is that if you're in mass media, a lot of the data visualizations are mostly just line charts or bar charts or maps. But that equips you with the basics. So I think Wall Street Journal published a very good book on telling data stories, data visualization. So picking that and then using any freely available tool, Infogram, Google Charts, what have you.
Okay, great. Well, thank you so much for being here and for providing our final keynote here.
Wow.
Do you recognize yourself?
Yeah, I do.
Good. So this is for you. We'd just like to say thank you so much. So let's give him a warm clap. Great.